It's the Real Estate Podcast, brought to you by ANZ Home Loans for financial well-beings.
And welcome back to another episode of the Real Estate Breakfast, chugging away through another week, talking all about your property news 7 days, as heard on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts and Amazon. Yes, I say chugging through the week because it is already a Thursday. This week particularly is going by pretty fast, August the 22nd. And how are you struggling with the rising cost of living, particularly when it comes to grocery prices, which are really just making it so much harder to save for a home deposit? I mean, it's not uncommon for a family of, let's say, 3, which might include a mum with a couple of children, spending up to $400 weekly on groceries, or you might be a family of 4 spending over $500 a week. And if you're trying to save for that very, very elusive deposit, you have the high rental costs to pay on top of that. So it's little wonder that it's extremely tough to get into the property market for the very first time. Of course, since 2022, several inquiries have been launched, while the efforts like the mandatory food and grocery code aim to improve transparency and hold supermarkets accountable. It's uncertain whether these measures will actually lead to lower prices. Experts are telling us this morning that unless recommendations are implemented, the inquiries may not result in meaningful change for consumers. In other words, it's a dead duck. Plenty of words, but no action. And if you would like to join in on the conversation, you can. Our email address is myrealestatepodcast@gmail.com. Well, this morning, once again, it is that time of the month to catch up with Nick Buick, the founder CEO of the On-Site Manager. And Nick, welcome back to the Real Estate Breakfast. How hard are those groceries for you at the moment?
Groceries are hard. I've got a family of 6, so there's my wife and now 4 kids. Even we're sort of feeling the pinch. We've got a couple of kids in private schools, and the grocery bills aren't getting any lower.
Very difficult, as I mentioned, to get into the property market. I mean, you wouldn't want to be trying to save, would you, in this current climate for a first-time property?
No, it's rough, and rentals are still very, very tight, and rental prices keep going up. It's not looking good, to be fair.
Now, we've been, of course, talking all about management rights and how people can get into this industry. And we're going to be stepping over a few different things this morning, like and this is going to be interesting for a lot of people, and that is the difference in management rights between the different states, because they do vary.
Yeah, that's right. That's probably one of the biggest differences between the states is the contract term for management rights and the separation of powers. So those are legislative differences that make a very large difference overall to how management rights operate between the states. So in Queensland, for instance, for accommodation modules, you can have a contract term of up to 25 years, whereas in, say, Victoria and New South Wales, they can be like 3 years or 5 years as a maximum term. So that means basically you're buying an asset that lives for however long that contract term is. You can top that contract up. Obviously, there's a lot more certainty when you're buying management rights in Queensland. And as a result of that, the majority of management rights do exist in Queensland. I believe there's about 4,000 management rights in Australia, 4,500 perhaps. And in Queensland, there are 3,500 of those schemes. So a lot of those management rights exist in Queensland because of the stable contract conditions that exist in this state.
Now, I would imagine then that if somebody is outside of Queensland and they're looking at those rights, because as you say, the rights in terms of years, they're far greater, people would just move into the state, wouldn't they?
That's right, yeah. A lot of on-site managers, there's 650 on-site managers in my agency currently, and a lot of them have moved here, not just from interstate, but also from overseas. It's sort of changed over the years. Back in the day, when I started 20 years ago, it was a lot of sort of ex-public servants and retirees and stuff that thought they were going to get a nice, relaxing sea change, and they would buy those, they'd get their golden handshake, and they'd buy some management rights because it was a nice, safe investment for them. But these days, it's a lot more sophisticated. There's a lot more syndication, a lot more sort of overseas buyers are snapping those up as well.
Now, here's a question for you. I'm not sure if you know the answer, although I'm sure you do. If you're living overseas, because we do have an international audience, not just in Australia, that listens to the podcast, and you decide to buy various management rights, but you still want to stay, let's say that you're living in Italy and enjoying the fine wine, and then you just put in your own managers into those sites. Is that something that is happening?
Absolutely, yeah. So we call that syndication. A lot of the time they'll be set up by finance broker specialists who deal in the financing of management rights. And what they'll do is, they'll take investors or silent partners, as they call them, who will front the capital. Essentially, they'll own the management rights. And it may not just be one investor. Sometimes there'll be a consortium. There might be like 4 or 5 investors, each throwing in, $250,000 each. And then their job is to front the capital and be quiet. And then they'll put in a highly experienced manager who's paid on a salary, and they will effectively run that management rights for them under license. The actual people that own the management rights are the investors, the silent partners.
Okay, so that's kind of like having a portfolio of properties, except you've got a portfolio of management rights and different managers doing all the day-to-day stuff.
Correct, yeah. So they do all the heavy lifting, and because they're put together by pretty experienced finance guys that have been in this industry for decades, they make sure that they very carefully vet who those managers are that go into those buildings, so they're highly experienced at what they do. It's not like they're putting people in on their first rodeo. And then those buildings generally are run really, really well. The profits are great. I see profits of up to sort of 20% return on investments for the people that are operating under those syndication models.
Wow, okay, so that is really interesting, and we are talking to Nick. He has all the answers when it comes to management rights. When we come back, we're going to be looking at the question that you might have, and that is, are management rights a good investment? And if they are a good investment, why? We'll talk about that next.
Every week we present so much real estate. Powerful, up-to-date news every morning from 6 a.m. Know your property with us on the Real Estate Podcast.
And right now it's time for another 30-second property tip. We go to the Gold Coast and to Currumbin and John Parks this morning. John, what have you got for us?
Craig, thinking about buyers, I think buyers need to put more value into private inspections. Call the agent, organise a private inspection. It's a competitive environment out there at the moment, so try and get ahead of the groups and try and get in on your own terms.
From interest rates rising, a shifting landscape, rentals running hot, clearance rates, a tight rental market, we cover it all every morning from 6 a.m. on the Real Estate Breakfast.
And it is a Real Estate Thursday. Hope your week is going well. And this morning we are talking management rights. I've learnt something myself in terms of you can do this from offshore, like have your own portfolio of management rights. And now we're up to that question, Nick. Are management rights a good investment? And if so, why?
They are considered a good investment. They're considered a safe investment, as a lot of people refer to them as a recession-proof business. I don't think anyone is completely immune to recession or economic pressures, but they generally perform fairly well. And like I said, if the building is run well by an experienced team of managers and the fundamentals are good, you've done your due diligence and done your homework and made sure that it's a good building with a good committee in place, like I said, the return on investment can be quite generous.
I just want to come back to, before the break, we were talking about just the fact that in Queensland you have all these management rights, you have the bulk of them. I didn't ask that question is, why is that the situation that Queensland kind of holds the majority majority of the pie?
Well, yeah, it's the contract term. So that being up to 25 years is longer than any other state in Australia. So that is conducive to the industry. It means the assets are typically more valuable because there's a lot more certainty and safety built into that contract term. And the other thing is we have separation of duties in our legislation. So, for instance, your strata manager, so the person who helps the body corporate run their committee, they can't be the on-site manager. That's considered a conflict of interest. Whereas down south, they can. So down south, you'll see a strata manager also acting as the letting agent in the building and also acting as the caretaker in the building. So they have a lot more power to do a lot more things. And in Queensland, we, from a legislative standpoint, seem to disagree with that ideology, that we think that's a dangerous thing to have one person wearing all those hats. So we separate those things off. So we have a separate strata manager, and then we have separate to that strata manager, we have the caretaker and the letting agent, which is typically the on-site manager.
That's really interesting in terms of what is happening down south. Okay, so obviously over the years, management rights, it has evolved. It's probably become a lot more sophisticated in 2024 as opposed to 2004.
That's right, yeah. So I got involved in the industry in around 2005, so about 20 years ago. And like I said, back then, it was a lot of mums and dads. It was just MAPA operations, semi-retired folk who wanted somewhere safe to park their money. Buildings were a lot smaller back then. Complexes were smaller, so the workload wasn't as much, and it was, quite a simple sort of setup. These days, we've got massive high-rises, huge resorts, very, very large complexes with hundreds and hundreds of lots in them, and they are typically requiring much more sophisticated levels of management. So that's sort of how the industry's changed, I guess. It's just due to the increase in size of schemes.
Yeah, and if we sort of come back to perhaps somebody getting into it for the very first time and coming back to the portfolio scenario, once they learn an industry, I mean, it's like anything, isn't it, in terms of business? Once you know the formula, you can multiply that many times over. It's just understanding how all the nuts and the bolts of this fit together.
Absolutely. Yeah, I work with quite a few managers who've, started with maybe one building and teamed up with a few people and formed a small team, and they've slowly grown that over the years, and, they might have 5 or 6 or 10 buildings sort of under their portfolio now. So, yeah, that definitely does happen. And when I speak to them, that's exactly what they say. They're like, we learn what the good fundamentals are, and then we just step and repeat that process and build our portfolio when we find attractive schemes to buy into.
All right, well, great to catch up once again on our Thursday morning. Look forward to talking more about this as time goes on. I better let you get back to the supermarket and go and feed that family of yours.
Thanks very much for having us as always. It's been great.
From buying strategies, a fluctuating market, the importance of data, geographical differences, confidence in the market, rental yields. Stay informed every morning from 6 a.m.
Everyone's got their opinion and everyone's got their circle of influence on sort of what to do and what not to do, but there's always a horror story about a build going over a couple $100,000. I guess buyers with young families, they'd rather just pay that in stamp duty and buy the finished product, and that way they actually know what they're buying, opposed to, look, we could potentially have this, especially around the inner north and the inner south of Canberra.
Yeah, so the downsizes, they're coming from different areas. Are you getting any downsizes that are coming in interstate at all?
I'll tell you what, the last 4 sales I've personally had over 3 million, they've all been from the Blue Mountains, every single one of them. And they're just moving from lifestyle blocks, acreage, homes that they built 20, 30 years ago, and they're just coming closer to family and just an easier lifestyle. In 15 years, I've never seen 3 in a row from the Blue Mountains, so they're doing well.
We connect you to the best real estate information across Australia. The Real Estate Podcast.